Maybe that's the bank holiday, maybe because it's very warm. I don't know, but maybe it's just people are fed up with the EU debates. So who knows? But welcome to the Cap and Gown. I'm Ted Marshall, the landlord. And we have probably the most, certainly in terms of the seniority of the politicians, we have a fantastic lineup tonight. So I'd like to introduce them. I won't tell you their background, that's down to Richard. Yes, but if the four politicians could come up with a big round of applause, please. So I don't know if everybody knows what the motion is tonight. Should I be passing this over to you, Richard? I think, yeah, I think you should take it. Yes, anyway, thank you very much. I'll pass you to my good friend, Lord Richard Fulmer of Worcester, who has been chairing every one of these debates so far. He's not going to be able to make June 13th, by the way, so I'm afraid you're going to be stuck with me on that date. Which is... it's going to be hard work, that. I haven't done this for some time, so but we should be okay, I'm sure. But apart from that, Richard's been here for every single debate, so can we have a round of applause, please, for Richard? Our chairman for today. Right, I'll hand you over to Richard now, thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Yes, as Ted says, we have a star-studded cast of speakers this evening. Certainly the most senior elected politicians that we have had in all the debates so far. The motion is: this House believes the European Union is undemocratic and this leads to corruption at the heart of its institutions and politics. Well, we haven't heard any speeches yet. It's a bit early to be saying hear, hear just for the motion.
Let's have an open mind.
Our first speaker this evening is David Heathcote Amery, who was Conservative Member of Parliament for Wells in Somerset for 27 years until 2010, and was a government minister for 8 years, serving in the Department of the Environment, the Department of Energy, the Foreign Office and the Treasury. At the Foreign Office he was Minister for Europe and negotiated the accession to the EU of Austria, Sweden and Finland. He resigned as Paymaster General in 1996 because of his opposition to the euro. He represented the House of Commons on the Convention of Europe, the Convention on the Future of Europe from 2001 to 2003. He is going to be the first speaker in favour of the motion.
Do I need a microphone or will they hear me anyway?
You need a mic.
Okay, I need a microphone. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for that introduction, most of which is true. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the motion says that, or suggests that the EU is undemocratic. I actually want to go a bit further than that and tell you that it's anti... Nope, switched off already. Hello, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Hello?
Is that any better? Thank you, right. I'm going to argue that actually, a little bit further than that, the EU is not just undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. But let's start with the lack of democracy. Why is the EU undemocratic? Because it denies us what every other country in the world has outside Europe, which is self-government. What is British history about? And you ought to know about this in Worcester because the last battle of the Civil War was fought near here. What is it about, history, than the struggle, the long struggle to obtain parliamentary rights and the right of the people, we the people, to make the laws under which we live. And this has been a very long process to obtain powers from an autocratic monarchy, and then to extend the franchise, and the struggles of these. Here we go again. I think I'm just going to show. It is working. Then we had the extension of the franchise, the suffragettes, to obtain what we now proudly call a parliamentary democracy. But what we've done is hand over this precious right of self-government to the European Union. Now, some people say, well, the EU is just like any other organisation, it's just another treaty. We belong to countless international organisations. No, the EU is different. The EU is a law-making body, and the laws that it makes are formally superior to anything that our own elected parliament can do. Quite unlike NATO, the Commonwealth, or any of the dozens of international treaties and organisations that we're signed up to. The EU is a dynamic, evolving organisation that makes the laws for us. And nothing you can do about that. You can't change the European Union government. All right, there's a European Parliament. We have about 10% of the votes. But even if all our MEPs were to vote against a bit of legislation, there's nothing they can do because majority voting in the European Union ensures that over half our laws are made in Europe, and most of them are by majority voting over which we have no control. And later in the debate, if you want, I can give you many examples of where a British government and the House of Commons, Labour, Conservative, whatever, have resisted a measure, but it's been imposed on us by majority voting. Now, this is not how the rest of the world is run. The ex-colonies, what was formerly the British Empire, they're all self-governing now. They have more control over their own affairs than we do. The United Nations is founded on the concept of self-governing nation-states. The United States, I was sad when President Obama started to tell us, for his own strategic interest, to stay in the European Union. It would be illegal under the American Constitution, which they fought a war for them to join an external body to make superior laws which our Congress could not resist. And I think the best test of all is this. How many other groups of countries in the world have followed the example of the European Union by setting up a supranational bureaucracy which has a monopoly over the proposals for legislation and which makes laws on behalf of that group of countries regardless of the wishes of national parliaments? How many other groups? None. Absolutely none. After 60 years, you might have thought that one group of countries in Africa or South America or Asia might have thought, well, that's working. I think we'll try that. None of them have. Why? Because they don't want to give up their democracy. It's as simple as that. They fought for it like we did. It's been a long struggle to obtain the right to make our own laws by representatives who we can vote in and vote out. No other group of country in the world has, for 60 years, followed the EU's government. Isn't that rather an eloquent testimony? So what it is the European Union is simply out of date. It's quaint. It's a centralised, bureaucratic, highly regulated, high-tax, low-growth model that nobody else has copied. The world has moved on. It's been replaced by a world of agile, adaptable nation-states that govern themselves. It doesn't mean that countries are isolated. All countries belong to a network of international organisations which they participate in according to their own interest. We don't do that. So it's no leap of faith for us to say we want to join the rest of the world. It's normal for countries to govern themselves, and we don't. Now, the second part of the motion says that this lack of democracy has led to corruption. Yes, it has. In some cases, it's literal. Chairman, you mentioned that I was in the Treasury. I was in charge for 2 years of, amongst other things, the European Union budget contributions. And in the very first year of my time there, the European Court of Auditors rejected the accounts on the grounds that they could not vouch for their correctness and regularity, and pointed to a great deal of fraud. Now, I was outraged by this, but I was told by my officials Minister, there's nothing you can do. Once the money goes over to Brussels, it's European money, not our own. So the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Commons, the National Audit Office, are completely powerless to do anything about it. And the sums are quite big, and they've risen. Today, we pay £13 billion a year into the European Union budget, and we get back about £4 billion for agriculture and regional aid. So there's a net contribution of £9 billion a year. And you know, 21 years later, they're still saying the same thing about the accounts. You know, if the European Union was a public company, all the directors would be in prison by now. You wouldn't survive the official auditors every single year saying that they cannot vouch for the regularity and correctness of those accounts. It is a scandal that your money goes to Brussels, it is misspent, as proved by its own European Court of Auditors, and there's nothing whatever you can do about it. Then, lastly, another type of corruption, political corruption. Promises made here by politicians are increasingly valueless. Just to take immigration as an example. Now, I'm personally not anti-immigration. I'm in business and I see the contribution that immigrants make. But at the present rate, our population is going to rise to by another 4 million over the next decade. And all political parties believe it ought to be controlled. Every single political party at the last general election had a control of immigration in its manifesto. It's a lie. They can't do it. Because there are 500 million people in the European Union who have a right to come here in unlimited numbers and to live, work, draw benefits, get on the housing list, have their children educated in limitless numbers. So you're being lied to systematically by all politicians at national level who pretend to control something which they literally can't. My last example is red tape. I said I was in business. I build houses for a living. We are tied up in regulations, so there's nothing we can do about them. The latest one is the mortgage directive. We don't grant mortgages, our firm doesn't, but because we have a shared equity stake in some of the houses that we've sold, we apparently get caught. So great cost, huge bureaucracy, we've had to register under the mortgage directive. I took this up with our MP, he said, nothing I can do about it, that's just the way it is. We complained, apparently the government tried to resist it, majority voted. We literally don't govern ourselves. So, Mr. Chairman, I conclude by repeating the point. It's a fatally flawed system of government, it's centralised, it's inefficient, it's corrupt, and it's hollowed out our own democracy without creating one of its own. So it's not only undemocratic, it's anti-democratic.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Our next speaker is Liz Lynn, who has served in 2 capacities, once in the House of Commons and then the second time in the European Parliament. Liz was Member of Parliament for Rochdale as a Liberal Democrat between 1992 and 1997, and from 1999 until she stood down in 2012, she was a Liberal Democrat Member of the European Parliament for this European constituency, the West Midlands. She was Vice President of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee in the European Parliament from 2004 to 2012, and was instrumental in protecting the UK opt-out of the Working Time Directive and shaping health and safety legislation. When she was an MP, she was the Liberal Democrats' frontbench spokesperson on health and community care, and then frontbench spokesperson on social security and disabled people's rights. Liz Lynn will speak against the motion.
And can I just clear up one thing that was said before about the Court of Auditors report? In actual fact, the last Court of Auditors report gave it a clean bill of health and has done for the last 7 years. So just to point that out, that that was factually not correct. In the past there have been problems, and there's still some problems with irregularities, a similar thing to they are in the Westminster Parliament. But I want to talk mainly about, having been both an MP and MEP, talk really about how the whole system works. Because when I became an MEP, I wasn't sure how the system worked in the European Parliament. And I know a lot of people, when I'm going around campaigning and talking to people, they come up with the unelected bureaucrats make the decision. Now that is far from the truth. Indeed, I think we have more power in the European Parliament than we ever had in the House of Commons as individual MEPs. In the House of Commons, unless you're a member of the governing party, you really don't have a say. And even if you're in the governing party, which at this time was elected by only 37% of the electorate, even if you're in the governing party, and if you're a backbench MP, you don't have much say either. I know some people have said, oh, well, they can go to see their MP and lobby for this, lobby for that, and they can raise it with the government ministers. Yes, they can, but usually they will be ignored. And the difference is, in the European Parliament, we have actual, as parliamentarians, real power. We can really make the difference. People talk about the unelected Commission. Now, the Commission have powers of initiative, yes. They can propose legislation, but they cannot decide on legislation. There's co-decision on most legislation now in the European Parliament and with the Council of Ministers. In other words, the European parliamentarians who are elected by everybody across the UK and elsewhere, and the ministers who are from every single member state, and it's the ministers and the parliamentarians who really make the decisions. What happens is the Commission comes forward with a work programme. The Council have fed into that as well. It comes to the European Parliament. The European Parliament make their views known about whether that work programme is something that should be going forward or shouldn't be going forward, and changes they want to be made. Once legislation comes through, and once it's proposed and drawn up by the Commission, similar to the way civil servants draw up the proposals now for the UK government, it comes to the European Parliament. The European Parliament then appoints somebody on that particular committee. And the committees are made up from MEPs from all different political parties, all different countries. And they appoint somebody on that political committee on a points basis. Whoever's got had the highest amount of people voting for them in the elections get the first pick of the legislation. They will then write the report and put forward their amendments to the Commission proposal. All the other MEPs from all the different political groups then put forward their amendments as well. Those amendments are debated. They are then voted on by the whole members of the committee. The committee then pass that on to the full plenary session of the Parliament. So it's been voted on, democratically voted on by the committee, then goes to plenary session to the whole Parliament. They then vote on it. After they've voted on that proposal, it then goes to the Council of Ministers, their proposal, the Parliament's proposal. If the Council of Ministers, like David Cameron, Angela Merkel, all the ministers, if they don't like what the Parliament's come up with, they then send it back to the Parliament. The Parliament then look at it again. I know it sounds cumbersome, but I think it's a very good way on deciding on legislation, because you get it right. Because you go through the whole process and get it right. And then it comes back to the European Parliament, it goes through the committee stage again, goes back to be voted in the full plenary session, and goes back to the Council. At that stage, the Council of Ministers, the elected ministers from each member state, and the elected parliamentarians, if they don't agree, you go into what is called conciliation for 6 weeks. So it's basically an ACAS type dispute. You have the ministers on one side and parliamentarians on the other side. At that point, the Commission are more or less acting as a civil servants. They don't have power. We would tell them what we wanted to draw up. If the Parliament had a view, we'd get the Commission to go away and draw up something to present to the Council. The Council will do the same. So the Commission don't have the power. If the Parliament decide that they cannot reach agreement with the Council of Ministers, the whole legislation falls and it goes back to the drawing board. Usually what happens is you get a compromise, like on the Working Time Directive, and I worked across parties on this. Philip Busher-Matthews for the Conservatives, and I were working on it together on the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. And we won it, and we kept and protected the opt-out, the voluntary opt-out of the Working Time Directive. Now, on most of the legislation that's passed, the UK is on the winning side of the argument 85–90% of the time. So in actual fact, we get our way on most pieces of legislation. And I think that's important for people to realise, that it is a democratic system. It's far more democratic than the majority of what goes on in the European Parliament. And it's democratic in the Westminster Parliament. Far more democratic than what goes on in the Westminster Parliament. And after all, we have proportional representation for the European Parliament. We don't for Westminster. I mean, I'd like to see a single transferable vote system, which I think would be even far more democratic. But we have the list system of proportional representation. If we had to have a list, then it should have been an open list. But at least it's proportional representation. When you actually look at the way this government was elected on 37% of the vote, and they rule this country, that's not exactly democratic.
We had a referendum on proportional representation. No, we didn't.
We didn't, unfortunately not. We called for a referendum on proportional representation, my party did, but unfortunately we weren't allowed to have one. I would have loved it if we'd had a referendum on proportional representation. We might have then got a proper system of government in this country, but indeed in the European Parliament and the European institutions, far from being undemocratic, I believe they are probably more democratic than what we have in Westminster.
Many thanks, Lynn. We're going to move on now to our third speaker, again in favour of the motion. This is my good friend from the House of Lords, Lord Hamilton of Epsom. He sits on the opposite side from me, but we are good colleagues and see alike on a number of issues. I won't tell you what my views are on the one we're debating tonight, because I'm trying to be impartial, as you know. He is a distinguished parliamentarian. He served as a member of the House of Commons from 1978 until 2001 as the Member of Parliament for Epsom and Ewell. He was Parliamentary Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher, and he was Minister of State at the Ministry of Defence, the Minister of the Armed Forces for 5 years between 88 and 93. Archie Hamilton, Lord Hamilton of Epsom, will speak in favour of the motion.
Thank you very much, my Lord Chairman, and I would like to say how very grateful I am to be here this evening and to see such a wonderful turnout. I've rather taken up watching television rather more than I have in the past. Whenever there's anything on about Brexit, I tune in. There was a rather interesting programme the other day where Jonathan Powell, who used to advise Tony Blair in Downing Street, did a sort of spoof interview, but the man he was actually talking to was a retired Italian commissioner, Portuguese, Portuguese. Anyway, the interesting thing that he said, in terms, if we were to leave the EU, is of course everything would be done in Brussels to make life unpleasant for Britain if we voted to leave, because otherwise other countries might hold referendum on whether they wanted to be in the EU. Does that not tell you everything about democracy in the European Union?
No.
They don't want people to hold referenda because, let me down, they might actually vote to leave in other parts of Europe too. And that is what is happening across the whole of the EU today. The whole dismal performance of the economy of the EU. Unemployment is double our rate over the whole of the EU, 10% to our 5%. And if you actually take Greece, where youth unemployment is 50%. Half the youth of Greece are unemployed. It's roughly the same level in Spain, and it's about 37% in Italy. The whole of southern Europe at the moment is suffering from the problems of the Eurozone, where the value of the euro is much too high for the southern states and much too low for the Germans and Dutch who export to them. So we see the EU experimenting with economic things that are doing absolutely nothing. They're impoverishing Europe as it stands today. So why do all these people want to be members of the EU? The answer is that if you're Greek or Spanish or Portuguese, you think the EU is wonderful because you're no longer run by a dictator. If you're Eastern European, you regard the EU as a godsend because you're no longer being run by the Soviet Union. We come from somewhere entirely different on this. We have an economic model that works, and they have one that doesn't. And because it's not working in Europe today, that is why they're so rampantly anti-democratic, because they do not dare test the opinion of the people of Europe in case they get the wrong answer. David has already referred to the effect of qualified majority voting, which means that we constantly get voted down. Whatever Liz says about us winning all the votes, you don't seem to have much of a chance of winning the votes when you've got 12%.
85 to 90%.
85 to 90% of the votes that we're supposed to be winning. But at the end of the day, we do things quite differently from most of our European partners. They have an economic model that doesn't work, and we have to go along with it because we're a minority in Europe. And if we want to prosper and succeed, we must look to the global markets outside, not to the EU today.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Archie. Our speakers are getting through their speeches quite quickly tonight. None so far has used their full 10 minutes, so we'll have a bit longer for questions later on. I should say, as far as questions are concerned, there are postcards on each table with pencils, and if during the interval, which will follow the final speech, if when we have the interval, you'd like to think of a question and send it up to us, then it'll be considered for answer during the final session. Now, our fourth speaker is a seasoned European politician. Edward Macmillan Scott was for 30 years a member of the European Parliament, representing Yorkshire and Humberside as a Conservative. He was elected Vice President of the European Parliament 4 times. And he was leader of the Conservative MEPs from 1997 to 2001, but he opposed David Cameron's decision to split from the European mainstream Christian Democrat Conservative EPP group after the 2009 Euro election. He then joined the Liberal Democrats. Edward Macmillan Scott will speak against the motion.
Thank you, Chairman, very much indeed, and thank you all for coming to this debate this evening. I was indeed a Conservative for many years, and as Richard has said, I left and joined the Liberal Democrats on a point of principle. It wasn't a great career move because I lost my seat in the succeeding election. But I'm here today because I believe very strongly, as a patron of the European movement, which is the only membership organisation arguing for a better understanding of the European Union, which was founded in 1947, and which is actively campaigning in this referendum for a Remain vote. I also live very locally. I live near Pershore. My mother's family came down from Yorkshire in the 1760s and have been farming here ever since. My wife is a lawyer working with children and has practiced both in Worcester and elsewhere in the West Country. So I'm a local boy. I'm glad to be here, and I couldn't possibly resist the invitation from Ted to speak in my capital city of my county here in Worcester. So thank you, Ted, for inviting me. My motive this evening in following Liz Lynn's argument about the democratic quality of the European Union is not only to talk about that, but what we actually can do as members of the European Parliament within this system. And also to deal with the second part of the motion, which is about how weaker institutions at an EU level lead to corruption, something about which I know something. I'll explain that in a minute. But having been elected in 1984, I very soon witnessed the enlargement of the European communities it then was to Spain and Portugal. A welcome move at that time, because not only were we bringing in two countries which had been under dictatorship, like Greece and so on, but we were extending our own markets. And this happened at the same time as the European Single Act, which opened up the market across a widening European Union. So, to my mind, at that time, it was a very benign situation. And it led to my taking on the role of spokesman on tourism for the European Parliament, because, representing Yorkshire, where 30% of employment was in tourism, I felt the European community should be doing more to actively support this extremely important industry, which Ted represents here this evening. And we got a budget for a European Year of Tourism in 1990. Only €8 million, not a huge amount. And we prepared for the year with competitions and chefs' rallies and a whole range of other activities, promotional activities. And it was a benign, helpful activity at a European level promoting the tourism industry across the EEC. However, in the course of the beginning of the year, I, as spokesman for the European Parliament on this issue, and having been the architect of the European Year of Tourism, was aware that there was a European official who was taking kickbacks, a Greek official known as Mr. 10% by the industry. And I made a series of protests, one of which was to resign my job as spokesman on tourism. And the Daily Telegraph journalist in Brussels at the time was one Boris Johnson. And he wrote the following paragraph in the Daily Telegraph, and listen carefully. Mr. Edward Macmillan Scott, the European Parliament spokesman on tourism and Conservative MEP for Yorkshire and Humber, has resigned his position as spokesman on tourism following allegations of fraud in the tourism unit of the So immediately my phone started ringing, and people said, what have you been up to? Hand in the till, so on and so on. Anyway, I rang Boris and said, what on earth have you just done? And he said, damn, he said, they forgot to put in the second paragraph, which made it clear you were protesting about this fraud. So I said, well, would you mind getting a correction, please, Boris? And he said, no, don't worry, old boy, there's no need. Very few people read the first edition anyway, which is, of course, people in Yorkshire. Anyway, that's Boris for you. But it leads me into the next point, which is that this particular fraud then led, over a period of years, various inquiries took place, to a committee of wise men being set up, 3 people with great experience, to look into the allegations of fraud, malpractice, corruption, nepotism at a European level. And this reported in March 1999. And I was very much involved in the preparation of the report, the evidence that was given, and so on and so on. And there was evidence of fraud, malpractice, nepotism, commission, people appointing their own families and so on. And it led, in March 1999, to the resignation of all the commissioners. Those of you old enough to remember may remember that evening. They fell on their swords, led by Leon Britton and Neil Kinnock. The consequence of that moment in European history, the first time, incidentally, that there had been a police investigation into the European Union, was a transformation in its approach. New regulations were introduced. David, as an accountant, will understand this. You have to have a proper regulatory system for public administrations, and that was brought into Brussels as a consequence of the resignation of the European Commission, and indeed the small fraud that began back in 1990. I was then asked, when I became a Vice President of the European Parliament, to chair its audit panel. Now, the financial regulation requires that every director in an institution, whether it's the European Commission, the European Court of Auditors or the European Parliament, where we have 35 different divisions, each of which now has an internal auditor, and it has to conform to the regulations. There are still problems. Of course there are. Any institution, especially one with 28 different nationalities, and dare I say, differing cultures in their approaches to public administration. But, despite all those difficulties, in 2004, the European Parliament voted to ban the employment of members of family. And as a consequence of the financial regulation, a series of other changes were brought in. For example, there is now a lobby register for not only the European Parliament but the European Commission. Westminster has still not achieved that, despite one language, one culture. And the assistants we employ in Brussels are all employed directly by the European Parliament. We can't get our hands on the money, as it were. And those who are employed in the constituencies must be employed by a chartered accountant or similar, and that is the way to ensure that there's very little fraud indeed. And when I was reading the other day in the newspaper that there's been some issue connected with the employment of people at Westminster, they're known as connected persons there. I mean, pause for thought on that one. But there are 169 MPs who currently employ a spouse or a partner or somebody who's connected to them. So when, for example, Daniel Hannan, who is quite well known Eurosceptic, who's written a book called Why Vote Leave, begins with this parody of the European Parliament as a wholly corrupt place where money is awash. He's writing about 17 years ago, not dealing with the present. And I'm quite proud of the work we did in the European Parliament in recent years, especially in cleaning things up. Now, when I said I would introduce a topic which also illustrates how, as an MEP, you could do something, you all know that the European Parliament wastes over £100 million a year going from Brussels to Strasbourg once a month for 4 days. And you probably think that's part of the system. Well, in 2010, I began a campaign for a single seat for the European Parliament in Brussels, which is the centre of activity politically and economically. And initially there was some resistance from the French in particular, but when finally I left the European Parliament in 2014, MEPs were voting 80% in favour of scrapping Strasbourg. My point in this story is that you can have an effect, not just through the committee system as Liz has done so brilliantly, but in a wider sense. You can make things happen in Europe. It is not a weak institution, the European Parliament. It is one that works, and it works for you. I beg to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much, Neil. We've heard 4 excellent speeches, and I'm sure you're thinking now about the questions you want to ask. But before we move into the next part of the evening and we have our interval, I'd like to ask Helen from the Worcester Community Trust to come and tell us a little bit about this wonderful charity and the work they do in our city.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'd really like to thank Ted, who's supporting Worcester Community Trust as his charity of choice during these debates. So thank you, Ted, and thank you to everyone. I know some of you have been here for many of the debates and supported us so far. Worcester Community Trust works in, we've got 6 community centres in the heart of the communities of Worcester. So you want to help us if you have a meeting, you need a training venue, you want to start a fitness club, talk to us first. We're your charity of choice. Also, with me tonight, we've run a range of projects as well. And with me tonight, I have Lisa representing the youth work that we do, doing positive activities with young people, the people who'd otherwise be hanging around outside the community centres. We run youth clubs for them. and Sharon, who represents our work with older people, because she runs the Snack and Chat lunch clubs for older people. We run a range of other projects as well, for children, for disabled people, for all the community, and we will really welcome your support. So help us by booking a venue or by putting some money in our buckets tonight. Thank you, Ted.
I'd just like to endorse what Helen has said so elegantly. It's a great charity. It's underfunded. We decided we should keep it local for Worcester. I think the ladies are coming around with the buckets. It isn't actually just 7 weeks, because I think we're taking you through to August. We raise actually a lot of money at our music events, and I say to people, look, we pay for musicians. We don't pay for people to actually listen to the musicians. We don't have an entry charge. So you should put your hands in your pockets, and I think it's the same for the debates as well. Everybody here is actually putting their efforts for, I mean, I know we sell a few beers, but we actually, believe it or not, do all the expense and the effort, we make very, very little out of this. So it is actually a sort of community service we're trying to do. So I'd ask you to give very, very, very generous to the Worcester Community Trust. Thank you. Right. I know you're all dying to get at the bar and have another drink. Just about the pub, yes, and we've actually got a couple of announcements. As of Wednesday, yes, this week, 2 days' time, we're actually gearing up to start to open at 8 a.m. in the morning. And we'll be doing takeaway breakfast and takeaway coffees at a full lunch menu. What we've done is I've spent a huge amount of money personally refurbishing the pub, and we're now ready to launch it as a cafe bar. So we're doing that. We're also as well doing quiz. Next week we're doing a poker night, we're doing a quiz. Yes, quiz and supper on a Wednesday. We do singles events, we've got music on a Friday, we've got music on a Sunday, and it's party night on a Saturday. So we don't take it all too seriously. It really is a very, very busy pub with a very big programme. Do follow us on Facebook, please, folks. It's all on there if you do Facebook, and you can find out what's going on with Gap and Gown, including these debates. Thank you very much.